By understanding the history of science, we really are asking for a history of truth. And physics over the last 150 years has been one of the exemplars of what it is to be able to know and control nature. I wanted to get away from what I thought was an overly simplified picture of the development of science that saw it as, on the one side, either as one continuous progressive line of development, or of gestalt switches, radical breaks that were incommensurable, unable to be compared in some ways. And in its place, over the course of the last years, I have tried to develop a picture where different domains of science are able to communicate, but partially, a little bit the way two different cultures might meet at the boundary and begin to form a pidgin or a creole. It's become a tool for me, a way of understanding the way knowledge gets put together at the boundary. Science itself is very much in flux just now. The problem is that general relativity in its standard form that's handed down to us by Einstein and quantum mechanics are not compatible. We know that at the limit of complicated phenomena like black holes, these can't both be true at the same time.
The most fundamental aspect of physical reality manifests as a wave, which can be pictured as a multi-dimensional wave like one would see if you threw a rock into a pond. And yet when that wave is measured or observed, or when quanta interact with other quanta, it appears not as a wave but as a point, a particle. What's interesting about a profound complementarity in these terms is that you can't view them both at once. Emergence exists in the cosmos at all scales and times. Atoms interact, and there's an emergent phenomenon called molecules, and molecules interact, and there's an emergent phenomenon right on up through our level in this seamlessly interconnected whole, where we have the emergent phenomenon of human consciousness. When individuals feel profoundly connected with the world in heightened religious awareness, lost in the dance, metaphorically, there is an area in the brain which ceases to function. So what is happening there on a very fundamental level is that we are putting ourselves in touch with our mode of awareness that existed prior to the evolution of complex language systems. And in that mode, we are blissfully one with the environment.
The whole thing about waveforms is that they exist throughout the spectrum, in macro and micro scale. But the funny thing is the human ear only perceives, again, this is more of a biophysics kind of scenario, but the human ear only hears within a certain small spectrum. And you can go below that spectrum and above that spectrum. But if you take that same metaphor and you look at the clouds above you, you look at the mountain eddies of the landscape from above, all of that is part and parcel of the idea of living in multiple waveforms. Like we're trying to the human being is almost just synchronizing these things and just trying to exist in a world where you're having these overlapping waveforms that in one level or another influence your full living pattern, you know. You're looking at the human structures we've made. This is what McLuhan always kinds of points out, is that we are turning ourselves inside out almost. Like the electrical networks are an extension of our nervous system, or the way memory works is now getting to, you know, outsourced to all these devices around us. Camera, iPod, you name it. So we let them remember for us. With DJing, for my art form and my art style, it was always meant to be kind of an investigation of the trace of the waveform, thinking about bass frequencies, treble, repetition issues, drum beats, patterns, but as an invisible sculpture, as a social sculpture. The idea here is to pull memory and its relationship to these kinds of physical phenomena into an art object that's invisible.
The most relevant scientific result of the last 30 or 40 years is the creation of far from equilibrium thermodynamics. Thermodynamics started in the 19th century, basically as a result of studying the steam engine. The craftsman who created the first one was quite ignorant of science, so that this was more of a product of craftsmanship rather than applied science. Evolutionary biology, when it only considers genes, enzymes, proteins, and so on, and natural selection, leaves all kinds of holes in the story, which can be taken advantage of by creationists and intelligent design people. Most of those holes can be plugged by incorporating far from equilibrium thermodynamics into evolutionary theory, because then the matter that genes act on is an active matter, is a morphogenetic matter. So that all that genes have to do is guide this active, morphogenetically pregnant matter in different directions to produce different species, and you don't have to count on genes to do everything, which is one of the reasons why there's holes in the theory of evolution. Far from equilibrium thermodynamics, it reveals a matter as capable of self-organization. So from a philosopher's point of view, particularly a philosopher like Gilles Deleuze, who is a process realist, that is, who believes that reality exists independently of our minds, your notion of matter, your concept of matter becomes different. And therefore art then will become not a form that the artist cerebrally imposes on an inert matter, but a partnership with matter, in which form comes from the interaction between the human and the non-human.
The body, it is an extra intelligent being which somehow compensates itself upon a certain challenge. I started to look for different artists which somehow are very honestly vulnerable, very honestly searching, using their own existence as material. In this process of searching, emanating a certain lightness, a certain aura, a certain vibration, from where it comes from. You cannot avoid to speak about the global body of today. In different corners of the world, the information goes immediately through us. Somebody here in Venice, and somebody in New York, or somebody in São Paulo had at the same time the same idea or the same intuition. How this energy circulates, how it works. These antennas of the artists, where this electricity comes from. It's very curious. I'm very curious about that.
Science is not science versus religion. Science is scientia, comes from the Latin, it means organized knowledge. The classic form of Western Orthodox Catholic Christianity is St. Thomas Aquinas. He quotes from the Philosopher, which is Aristotle, because they had just recently come across, before that it was Plato in the Middle Ages, but now via the Arabic Islamic civilization and the Crusades and northern Spain, they've gotten lost texts of Aristotle. So he says, the Philosopher states, and he's taking this is rationalism, this is secular knowledge. And the apostle from Scripture, Paul states, and he comes up with this encyclopedia, basically, which for a few days, hours, in the 13th century, everything has been compiled and it makes sense. He doesn't deny any, it's a logical progression. It's science as they know it, as it exists. So science and religion, they're complementary. In the beginning, God created Adam, Homo. His creation is a human. God isn't masculine. The old man with the beard, that's Zeus, the Father, sitting on the throne in heaven, and that's not Jehovah, that's not Yahweh. The God whose name cannot be said, the Tetragrammaton, the living God, whose name is I am. Is my name. And isness is change. They had a big fight whether Jesus was of like essence with the Father or of the same essence. Homoousios is the essence, or homoousios, one vowel. And they decided, no, it was homoousios. He was the same nature. The transcendent actually becomes immanent totally and is in his creation.
Classical yoga is basically a dualistic philosophy in that there is spirit and there is matter, and the two are not connected. There is Purusha, which can be thought of as spirit or awareness, and then there is Prakriti, which is raw, undifferentiated matter, from which everything around us evolves. And that concept of evolution is kind of interesting because there is evolution and devolution. It flows out from the source and it flows back into the source, and the smallest increment of time is one flowing outwards and back inwards. And the proportions change, and that's how we experience change. And then there is Ishvara, which is the closest you get to God. And Ishvara is an idealized Purusha that has never been tainted by matter and by time and by karma and any of that. And so it's pure awareness, pure being, the ideal. And everything around us basically boils down to the proportion of these qualities. There's the tendency to change, the tendency to stay the same, and pure existence without the tendency to change or to stay the same. Your spirit, your true self, is like the moon, and your mind, what you think of yourself, is like the surface of a lake, and that every thought and every sensory stimulus that you have and every action that you do is like a rock dropping into the lake causing ripples. So you have to still the surface of the lake, and then when it's undistorted, then you are in a position for enlightenment to happen. The intelligence of the body is by nature a grosser intelligence, so it's bound down in the physical world. But you can take that level of vibration and you can refine it to the point that it's comparable to the level of vibration of the mind, which, as we all know, is very fleet and like Quicksilver will get away from you. Once you've got that sense of refinement, you can then have an attitude of expectation, an attitude of poise, a beginner's mind, an attitude of receptiveness.
I think there's a point at which scientists do realize that there is the great excluded middle, and that there is contradiction, but they don't see it as contradiction. They call it a bifurcation. They develop a word to explain this phenomenon. Okay? And it usually occurs at the level of subatomic particles, where the basic rules of reason do not hold at all. There's not one world, but many, many worlds that are going on simultaneously, and there is movement between and among these worlds. And logos is one word for nature itself. Okay, it's one word for being itself, as a kind of oneness. Now, though there are these disparate things, they still fall under this oneness, which scientists feel, I think most scientists feel very comfortable with.
They use zero-point energy, implicate order. It's the holographic, it's the spectral domain. I call it holoflux. The hologram is basically a set of interference patterns between ripples. If we didn't have lenses and other lens-like structures in all of our senses, the world would look to us as if it were a hologram. Philosophers are very good at asking questions, things that we haven't been thinking about. The philosophers, we need them. Wittgenstein wrote the Tractatus. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. And then he went beyond the limits. Communication is non-material and non-local.
I mean, I think it's a complicated question what relationship Heidegger might have to physics. I think that in an odd way, I mean, Heidegger was dubious about the scientific form of description of nature because of what he thought it assumed without criticism, and maybe partly what he inherited from Husserl and his feeling that the world was stripped down of too many of its qualities when one moved to a mathematical physical description of things. But I think at a more generous reading of Heidegger might say that in a different way, Heidegger is trying to get away from the human description of the world, although he passes through the human description of the world to get at other things. He sees the history of being as being a larger history of which we are only a part, maybe a crucial part, but not the center in some way. And oddly enough, and in very different ways, physicists also would like to have a description of the world that doesn't depend too much on the all-too-human. And it's been a debate within physics for many years. Einstein hated the idea that in quantum mechanics we irreducibly interfere with the world, and he wanted to have a description that was somehow had the classical austerity of a completely outside description, outside of the human. So there may be some aspects that are similar to that, and the drive to try to get outside ourselves, to know the world in our absence in some ways.
Theology and science, after all, they are very similar. It's something that is part of us, you know, asking where we come from, why are we here, the big usual questions, you know. We tend to be more comfortable sometimes when we have a precise answer, so that we feel, okay, now I know what to do. Okay, if the universe is dynamic, and if now it seems that everything is moving away from each other, it means that, again, if we play this movie backwards, it means that everything in an earlier time was closer together. And if you can extrapolate, imagine a very early time, things were really, really coming together. They were all in the same place. Thanks to Einstein and his theory of general relativity, people use this mathematical formalism really to describe an ideal object, a hypothetical object, that is so dense that would prevent even light from escaping. At the time, it was just a mathematical exercise, if you want. Einstein himself didn't believe that such objects could exist. And in fact, people start seeing things moving around a center where there was nothing, but things were moving around in a very predictable pattern. And people start saying, well, then there might be something like a black hole there. A star is made by a large, huge amount of gas, mainly hydrogen and helium. What happens is that all the layers on top of the core are not supported anymore and will collapse towards the core. And there will be a collapse and then a bounce back, which will determine a supernova explosion. That's how very massive stars end their life. And depending on how much matter you have there, and will be squeezed. And when the volume essentially goes to zero and there is a huge amount of mass and no volume, that determines an infinite density. And that's how the black hole comes. Science is about asking questions, not just to find the last, give the last word. Yes, we want to find the answers. This is why we ask the questions. But as soon as we get an answer, we have other 10 questions that we want to answer. To be a dancer, you have to use a lot of laws of physics. For me, dance is more like a language. As math is a language of science, and as often happens when people are able to speak more than one language, there is a deeper understanding of the meaning of the words. At the end, we all talk about nature, and we all talk about human beings.